Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Ndubisi Nwokolo. On behalf of the Nestor family, I warmly welcome all of you to the second development discourse for the month of March. 2 weeks ago, we had a discourse here which focused on identity politics. We looked at a post-election violence in Nigeria. Today, we'll be looking at protectionism, trade, policy option, and way forward. As a matter of fact, with the way Nigerian economy has been for a while now, and considering the administration's economic recovery program, which one of the cardinal principles is to drive industrialization through small and medium-scale businesses, we felt there was need for us to interrogate the issue of trade policies in Nigeria. How does this affect the small businesses, considering that our economy seems to be struggling? What we've done this afternoon is to try to bring 3 experts who will be interrogating this. And as a matter of fact, after their presentation there will be a moderation. And then, as audience, the floor will be thrown open for each and every one of us to join in the discussion. So, today we have Dr. Nonso Bikeli. Nonso is a policy associate at Economic Research South Africa and chief economist at this day. Nonso has a PhD in economics from State University in New York. And if you Google him, you will know he has published a lot. And again, we have some other person who has done a lot of work as well in the area of economic policy. Dr. Titigiwa Akidende, she's a team lead at DFID Policy Development Facility. She has worked both in the UK and in Nigeria, of which one of them is, she was among the people that maybe wrote the economic policy for the Office of the Vice President. Maybe she will explain that to us today. The third person is Mr. Ken Okoha. Ken is the president of our National Association of Nigerian Traders. He's on his way, so definitely he will be here. So as we go on, we would love you to share your thoughts on Twitter and Facebook via Nestor SPD using the hashtag @protectionism. So you can see it on the board. So without much ado, I will invite Nonso, who will first start, and then Dr. Giwa Kidinde will join him.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming. As he said, this is supposed to be a more interactive discussion, a bit less of us, the panelists, talking to you, and you asking questions, and a bit more of us discussing about the topic. So what I'm going to do now is to try to set the theme for that by asking a set of questions and to try to shape how we think about this issue. And as an economist, I'm always prepared to talk for a while. So hopefully by the time I finish talking, the last speaker will be here and we can get on with the panel. Now, protectionism is not new. It's something that everyone kind of knows about. It's a problem, not just in Nigeria, or if you think of it as a problem, it's a phenomenon, not just in Nigeria, but around the world. Lots of countries want their industries to do well. Lots of countries want their businesses to do well. And one of the questions is, how do you enable that to happen? And many countries see trade policy as a way to do that. If you can somehow tilt the scales in favor of your domestic industries, then is that good? Does that help? Does that work? I want to kind of get into the theme of that today. Of course, in Nigeria, we're not new to this topic. Every day we hear somebody in the newspaper talking about how we import X million dollars worth of this, or X million dollars worth of that, and how we need to do something about it because it's not good for us. From rice to tomato to pizza, many things which we hear in the news. And so the big question is, what is the way forward? How do we think about trade policy in the context of supporting our domestic industry, but also thinking about some of the costs as well? What should our trade policy agenda be? What is it now? And ideally, what do we want it to be? Now, it's useful to think about trade a bit more systematically. If I ask a question here, how many of you actually grew what you ate for breakfast this morning? I'm sure nobody would raise their hands up. Did anybody grow their own food this morning? No. But we all hopefully had breakfast, most of us. And so as individuals, trade is a fundamental part of our lives. We go out in the morning, we do some productive activity, we create some value, and then we trade that for the things that we want to eat, or to buy, or to consume. And whatever excess we have, we accumulate it as well. So for individuals, trade is a very straightforward thing. For businesses, the story is the same. This is next year advisory. I assume they did not make these chairs. They just bought them, right? Because they don't make chairs, they do other things. And so they spend their time doing what they feel is some product activity. They have some costs. Instead of making the things that they want, they just exchange some of the value that they created for the things that they want. And whatever excess is profits, or if it's an NGO, it's part of the fund for whatever their activities are. And so for firms, the logic is the same. Trade is overall a good thing. But does the same story work for countries? Is it that simple, or is it more complex? Now, every country trades. We know that. Even North Korea, which is one of the strongholds for self-sufficiency, still trades with China, trades with other countries. But what do you do if you have systemic problems that mean that you always seem to import more than you export? Remember, trade goes both ways. You import some things, you export some things. What do you do if you have systematic challenges? What do you do if you have exports that don't particularly tie into your secondary objectives? Here, we talk about jobs all the time. We need to create jobs. What do you do if your export is in something like crude oil that does not create jobs? What do you do? And what do you do if you have lots of other reasons why your domestic firms can't compete? Now, historically in Nigeria, we've kind of had lots of these protectionism debates, right down to the 60s, if we start from there. In 1960, we implemented a 90% tariff on textiles to support the domestic textile industry. We're not sure how that went. All through the period, we've had various forms of different kinds of interventions to kind of boost domestic manufacturing or to boost domestic activity. Some have been marginally successful, if you can call it that. Fruit juice is one of those that people have said has been kind of successful. At least if you go into the store now, you can see made in Nigeria fruit juice. Not concentrate, but fruit juice itself. More recently, we've had tariffs on things like cars, rice, many things. So we're not new to the protectionism debates. It's something that we've practiced for a long time. Now, theoretically, we know that when you implement that kind of policy, there are many effects. On one hand, from theory, there's a positive side. If you implement restrictions on imports, whoever manufactures that domestically would get some more profits. It's almost a certainty, at least for most things. And if you create tariffs on imports, of course, governments collect the taxes and they get revenue. So that's also a positive, a potential benefit. But there's also potential costs as well. One of the costs that we seem to ignore is the cost to consumers. When you place a tariff on something, prices go up, consumers have to pay more for that thing. It's a very real cost. And so, in general, we tend to ask the question for any policy, are the benefits more than the costs? And that's the question which we kind of are going to ask today. Yes, we know there's some benefits, yes, we know there's some costs, but are the benefits more? Are the costs more? Theoretically, we would expect the costs to be more than the benefits, all things being equal, but also we know that if there are cases of productivity growth, then it doesn't have to be the case that the costs are more. If your firms intrinsically become more productive, then there may be benefits to these kinds of trade policies. Can we get answers to that? But when we talk about productivity growth, there are many other things that count for firms, right? It's not just trade policy. You have to think about electricity problems, think about infrastructure, security, human capital. All these things also count for how productive a firm is. So can we think about trade policy in isolation of these things? If we're in an environment where all these other factors make industry just a lot more difficult, then is trade policy the real key policy that we should be thinking about? Or do we have to think about this in the context of everything else? Now, one of the things I've always wondered, and this is just a casual, I'm not proposing this in real life, but just a theoretical thing. One of our largest imports is fuel, PMS. As at Q2, it accounted for almost 30% of all our imports. Now, if we really believe that trade policy can spur domestic production, why haven't we tried to implement that for fuel? We have all the raw materials to refine fuel. We know how to do it. It's very easy. I mean, I don't know how to do it personally, but generally, it's not a difficult thing to do. And it's difficult to argue that fuel is more important than food. People eat food. If they don't eat, they will probably die. But if you don't have fuel, we can still kind of walk around. So if you really believed that trade policy was the key for industry, why haven't you tried to implement it for fuel? And of course, you can't talk about trade policy without smuggling. So this is a map I got from a paper, and it's our neighbor to the west, Benin Republic. And it shows the number of border posts, informal border posts, across the border in Benin Republic. If it's dark blue, there's up to 10. And as we can see, there are hundreds of informal border crossings between Nigeria and Benin Republic. So can you think about trade policy without taking this into account? How do you implement trade policy when you have Benin Republic right there, who everybody along the border has access to? I mean, there's a physical border in maybe Seme, but everywhere else, it's just an imaginary line in the sand. So how do you implement trade policy in that context? And just to give an example, I looked up the prices from one of these sites that has price comparisons for 1 kilogram of rice in Cotonou versus Lagos. In Cotonou, it's about 435 naira. In Lagos, it's about 1,380 naira. And so if we think about trade policy in the context where we have such high differences in prices across borders, should we really be asking why are people smuggling? Because it seems pretty obvious that with that kind of scenario, people will try to make money. Or should we be asking why are prices so different? Why is it the case that rice in Cotonou is 500 naira, but here it's almost 3 times as much? And so given these smuggling challenges, what is the role that trade policy should play? What kind of trade policy can we successfully implement given these realities that we have on ground? Now, we're trying to think of trade policy from only one angle, from only the imports perspective. How do we stop imports? How do we stop imports? But trade works both ways. You import some things, you export some things. So what is our trade export policy? Of course, we know we can't go to Ghana and ban something. We don't have that kind of authority. And so if we're thinking of trade policy for exports, what are we really doing to get Nigerian products into other countries? And just to give an example, 2 of the countries that we cite as countries that have used trade policy to support their industrial economy are South Korea and China. But South Korea did something that's very interesting in the 60s. They shifted from policy focused on import substitution to policy focused on export promotion, which is a very different thing. Their trade policy became focused solely on how to get South Korean products to other countries. They had things like low interest loans for companies that exported, free imports for raw materials, and I mean, I can't cite a source for this, but they may have built a prison and told all the big CEOs, if you don't increase productivity, you will end up there. And you can see the results, right? Their exports start to grow radically from the 60s up until now. The story in China is kind of different, but it's kind of the same. At some point, the focus shifted from what can we do in China to what can we do for the rest of the world. There's all these stories about special economic zones where everybody was allowed to do whatever they liked, with the focus being on how do you export Chinese products everywhere else. And so the question is, what is our trade policy for exports? If we think about how we stop or how we restrict foreign goods from coming in, then how are we thinking about how we get domestic goods from going out? And I wouldn't be an economist if I didn't at least bore you with one graph. So this is the graph of the volume of our imports and exports from 1980 up until now. And we know the Nigerian economic story. There's no growth after SAP. SAP is somewhere over there. From SAP until about 2000, there's no growth in the economy, no growth in imports, no growth in exports. But around 2000, the economy starts to grow. Imports start to grow as well, as you would expect. If people get richer, they tend to want to buy more stuff. But over the period where we experience relatively rapid economic growth, exports are basically the same. There is almost no growth in exports. If anything, there's a slight decline. Part of that story is we export only crude oil. And so the question comes back. When we think about trade policy, what is our policy for exports, or specifically non-oil exports? And of course, we can't think about trade policy without thinking about the global political context. All around the world now, there's lots of mini trade wars, as we call them. There is a US-China trade war, which is the most popular. You know, US and China sparring on how to exactly deal with their trade balances. There's Brexit, which indirectly has trade implications, because if Britain leaves the EU, then they have to negotiate all these trade deals, depending on how they leave anyway. And you have all sorts of other issues like the negotiation of the TPP and all that. So there's chaos in international trade politics, at least more chaos than there was 10 years ago. But as a wise friend said, chaos is a ladder, and it's an opportunity for those who are outside to get inside. One example is the outcomes for soybeans in Brazil due to the US-China trade dispute. Of course, on the Chinese end, the thing that they targeted was US soybeans exports to China. And here you have Brazil stepping in and saying, hey, you don't want US soybeans, but we have lots of soybeans we can give you. And between 2017 and 2018, soybeans exports to China, or soybeans export from Brazil in general, jumped about 37%, to the point where they had a $20 billion trade surplus with China, simply by breaking into the game because the US and China were dueling in their trade wars. So again, what is our trade policy for exports? What are we doing to get Nigerian goods to other countries? So hopefully I've asked lots of questions that will spur the panelists and that will hopefully spur the debate as we go on. Thank you.
Thank you, So I think we don't need to start answering. We have someone who will do some of the answering for us, and then we'll key into what she has said, and then we can provide our own answer to your questions. Can I welcome Dr. Titi Kiwakidende to the podium?
Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a privilege and an honor to be here and to talk on this topic. I would not call myself a trade policy expert. I am an economist. I have special interest in development because I studied development economics. But I've also been working for the past few years in the trade policy space. So I will not be able to answer all the questions that Nonso raised. But I will, give some perspective, my perspective, on some of these issues. I think I agree with Nonso by saying that trade has been around since human beings have been around. There's no man who is an island, so you just have to trade. It happens all the time. Trade by barter, whatever means, we all trade. And as Nonso said, it's usually quite simple between individuals or between organizations, but when we come to countries, it gets really complex. The reason obviously being that incentives and goals and objectives get really complex at that level. So, but basically, generally speaking, what are the trade policy objectives usually? What are they? It's usually, for Nigeria, it's stated that the objective is to diversify the export base and continue to liberalize the economy, which sounds to me like a very laudable objective to have as our trade policy in this country. But also, generally speaking, there are other things. Sometimes countries do it because they want to improve the competitiveness of their firms. Sometimes it's to stimulate local value addition. Sometimes it's to create an environment and facilitate capital inflows. Sometimes it's to provide opportunities for technology transfer between their country and another country. So, the objectives could be quite broad, but for Nigeria, it's really about, well, it's supposed to be about diversification of the export base and to continue to liberalize. And what are the instruments usually that are involved in trade policy? We usually would have either tariffs, which are fiscal instruments that really focus on either, duties, those sorts of things that raise fiscal revenue, or you use non-fiscal measures, non-tariff measures, such as quantitative restrictions, such as licensing. So when you introduce a license to a particular good or something, then it's about how much of it you can actually either import or export. And then there's also outright prohibition and bans. So countries do different things depending on what the objectives are. But generally speaking, these things either lead to more protection or more liberalization. So a country needs to decide really what it wants to do. For me, I look at trade as personally, I think trade is a positive thing for any country. We've established that no man is an island and neither is any country an island. Basic economic theory tells you that trade happens as an opportunity for you to grow, because if you're able to specialize in your areas of comparative advantage, you will make more of that particular thing that you have comparative advantage. You can't consume it all, you exchange it for something else. So trade is a good thing, basically. So why then do sometimes countries, employ protectionist policies, and why do others not? I think for generally speaking, there are certain, I guess, conditions where protectionism could be a good thing. So usually the argument is, oh, we want to protect the infant industries, they're just starting to grow, so we need to protect them, and therefore we bring in some protectionist policies to try and encourage that. But I would say that in order for those sorts of policies to actually deliver on those sorts of aspirations, you have to first understand the potential in those industries. What's the potential? If there is a potential for growth, and it's really established that such industries would grow and deliver for the economy, then perhaps it's worth doing some protectionist policies. However, such policies should never be, well, in my view, should never be forever. At best, a protection for a particular industry should be temporary. So, and should also be accompanied with commitment from the companies in that sector. If you don't do that, you create a world where the companies in that particular sector that's protected, they sort of enjoy the protection. And with time, you find that the productivity doesn't necessarily go up in that sector because they're protected. There's no driver to cause them to push productivity up, and therefore they're not competitive. And with time, you find that whatever is being produced in that sector may not be competitive globally. And so your purpose for protecting them in the first place doesn't get delivered because the goods are not competitive worldwide. And I think we have examples of that in Nigeria. There are things that are produced in Nigeria in protected sectors, and you find that when you compare with China, for example, it costs so much more in Nigeria than in China, and it's cheaper, but then we don't want the cheaper goods. So consumers are stuck in this circle of really expensive goods that cost a lot. So is that an optimal situation for any country to be in, is the question I ask. One of the questions, I mean, going through my thoughts on this when I was preparing, I just thought at the end of the day, what exactly underpins Nigeria's trade policy? If with protection, consumers are getting stuck in a high price, low quality cycle. Why is Nigeria doing this in some sectors? Why? So I don't have the answer, but I'm hoping this discussion will generate some of those answers for us. Of protectionist policies, I guess, particularly where there's a, maybe that there are goods that are coming in from other countries that could have health implications and stuff like that, a ban could be brought in. But where none of those things apply, then I think a country needs to be really clear on what its motivations are and what it wants to achieve with its trade policy. Now, I'm going to do a quick run through Nigeria, because I know we all know that, or we all say that Nigeria's got a traditionally protectionist stance on trade. And I think we would all be right in saying so. In the first 20 years of Nigeria's independence, it operated a regime of very high quantitative restrictions, high import duties, and outright bans on certain items. And that went on for 20 whole years. And then came the 80s, when there was a policy shift, a very small shift towards export promotion in the 80s, and the use of local raw materials. But then I think that manifested in import substitution, more restriction, and in the end, just as the graph that Nonso showed, we ended up in a no-growth period between the 80s and the 2000s. So basically speaking, those years of protectionist policies, well, as the data shows, didn't deliver growth for the economy. And the sectors that were being protected, for example, the textile sector, died, basically. So again, I ask, what underlies the policy that Nigeria is pursuing on trade? Then came the 2000s, when Nigeria had put in place certain development plans, medium-term plans, like NEEDS, the 7-point agenda, the transformation agenda, which had trade components, which focused on enhancing competitiveness of the domestic industries, promote domestic value added, and diversify export. But then I look at the data, and that was since the early 2000s. This is now 2019. Not sure what has been delivered again. And it makes me wonder the documents say one thing, but what happens in reality is another thing. So that's another question that I think we should ask ourselves. When we write these documents, these policy documents that Nigeria, is supposed to be pursuing, what goes wrong thereafter? Okay? And then, quite frankly, I think we're at a point where we should be discussing which way forward for Nigeria. For me, I think Nigeria has tried the protectionist policies for so long now that it doesn't take rocket science to realize that it's time to drop it and do something different. If you keep doing the same thing, you can't get a different result. So Nigeria just really needs to change certain things and really mean it this time. We've been working in PDF in the trade policy space. The reason why we started up a trade policy work stream was because of that protectionist stance. One of the reasons why I think that has continued so much for so long in this country is because the trade policy debate is very, very much influenced by the few people that gain from that protectionism. So the reality, those who talk about public policy and those sort of trade policy and in the trade policy space, there are different reasons why countries do protection, and it's because some people gain. Now, with any policy that a country does, there will be winners and there will be losers. That's just normal. There are always winners and there are always losers. Ideally, when you get to, you pursue a policy that should expand the utility frontier for everyone as a whole. To get to that point, yes, there are winners and there are losers, but theoretically speaking, there should be some way that the winners can compensate the losers. And that way we all get to a better place for our utility, our welfare, and so on and so forth. So why do we not do that? Because in reality, those who gain don't necessarily compensate those who lose. So we look at it and think, what's going on here? For those who have been gaining from the protectionist policies for all these years, is there a way that we can get them, or to make them make those transfers to those who are losing and get to a better place? Is it possible? Do our policy makers think about these things? These are all questions that I have. I don't have the answers necessarily, but I think it's something we should all think about. And also, in terms of diversifying the economy, personally, I think we're at that point where the country needs to now pursue a policy that allows the economy to grow. And personally, I think that could happen through two sorts of, I guess, mechanisms. One is to be able to attract FDI and bring that in, invest that in our infrastructure, those things that really, present a serious constraint to the growth of industries. And if we're able to address those things, then perhaps that could, generate the growth that we need. The other way, I think, is also to then pursue an export-led growth. So basically, I call it driving growth through export. And how do we do that? There was a study done by the ODI some time ago. I think we disseminated that. It was called Supporting Economic Transformation in Nigeria, and it was disseminated back in 2015 or 16. And that study looked at a couple of economies that have managed to turn their fortunes around. And one of the things that it proposed, that was proposed in there, is that just basic economic theory, Nigeria should identify a few sectors in which it has comparative advantage, pursue exporting the product, the output of those sectors. Now, how do we do that? As a starting point, I would propose that Nigeria needs to engage with those in such sectors. So one, identify the sectors that have that potential. Find them. Once they're found, engage the businesses in that sector, especially the MSMEs. Please don't go after the usual suspects that are usually at the table when policy is being made. Manufacturers Association of Nigeria, their voice has been well heard over the last 30 years or so, and we haven't really progressed. So maybe new voices need to be heard when Nigeria starts to really think about going forward. And I don't have anything against Manufacturers Association of Nigeria. I'm just saying we need new voices to be involved in making these policies. So my proposal is get the people within those sectors together with government to start to talk about that sector and what needs to change in those sectors. And thereby develop a strategy that will, lead to exporting from those sectors and move them forward. In thinking about such sectors, one thing that did come to my mind was technology innovation. Nigeria could export some of those things. They're not the traditional sectors we would think about, but it just came to mind when what are the things that Nigeria could export? I mean, we heard this in Lusaka when we went to the World Export Development Forum last year, that there's a company in Nigeria that uses drones to deliver, uses satellite imaging and GIS technology to provide information to farmers. And it just uses its drones to deliver those information to the farmers wherever they are. That's technology that is grown here in Nigeria. Why isn't Nigeria exporting this to other countries? It doesn't have to be the EU. Other African countries, for example, they don't have this technology. Nigeria has it. It's already happening. Why isn't Nigeria trying to, export some of these technologies to other countries? that need them. So it's about thinking quite, I guess, creatively about what are the areas that Nigeria has comparative advantage in. What are they? Let's find out what they are. Then get the people together within that sector to really truly understand what are the issues that are preventing them from growing. If you are able to engage the smaller guys in these sectors, then the potential to grow those sectors would be utilized. The smaller guys need to grow. And when they grow, jobs are created. So it should not be a strategy that only involves the big guys. It should really focus on the small guys, small businesses, women, youth. Get them involved and work out how best to support them. Such support could include things like government basically addressing the constraints directly through policies or whatever. Government could also kind of like provide insurance for these small businesses. I know there's NERSOL that provides insurance for the agricultural sector, but when we find these other sectors that, could deliver the growth for this economy, it would be useful to have the businesses there have some kind of insurance so that failure does not mean the end of the business. It just means that they learn and they're able to reinvent themselves and continue to grow. There's also other things around building their capacity, addressing access to finance constraint, the ease of doing business. So thankfully, Nigeria's made quite a stride in the ease of doing business. We've been working particularly in the area of entry and exit of goods, and particularly exit of goods. And in that area, we've come across so many people in that sector. PDF has supported exporters. Some of them are potential exporters, and some of them are just export-oriented people. And we find that very many constraints occur that keep them from being able to, even the finance that's available in BOI, etc., they're not able to access it because they're the little guys. So it's about supporting those little guys either through capacity building, helping them with business modeling, and so on and so forth, to try and deliver the growth. My view is that at the end of the day, if Nigeria is able to do those things, there's another thing that I think would be key to deliver for Nigeria, and that's coordination. That's a huge challenge in Nigeria, coordination. The policies are not together. They're not well coordinated, and therefore it's difficult to deliver. So I think to my mind, once the industries have found the requirements to support them are understood and who will provide them, private sector has a role to play in this as well, then it's about coordination. Because without somebody having responsibility to coordinate all that is required, it will never happen. Like I'm speaking to the ease of doing business people, they tell us that only those things that are measured get done. If nobody's measuring, if nobody's cracking the whip, as it were, then nothing is going to happen. And in Nigeria in particular, so, I mean, the question, Rick, it raises the question, whose responsibility should this be? We would say government, yes, but who? Who in government should be responsible for this coordination that's required, because without it, implementation would fail? Your guess is as good as mine. The only thing I can say, though, is that the Ease of Doing Business Secretariat is a good example of where extra ministerial authority has worked. In Nigeria, having one ministry coordinating something that important may not work because of the structures that we have. Therefore, some thought should be given to who coordinates the effort and therefore deliver. So at the end of the day, I think it's just simply put, Nigeria's experience following protectionist policies has not delivered for Nigeria. It's time to change it. How do we change it? We get ourselves together, identify which way we need to go, get government to give the sectors the support that it needs, get somebody to coordinate and ensure that it happens. And then I think Nigeria could be in business. Thank you.
Once again, thank you, Dr. Giwaki Nende, for that presentation. I will invite Mr. Ken Okoha. Mr. Okoha is the president of National Association of Nigerian Traders. So he will be contributing to this discourse. So let's see what his perspectives are to what we are discussing this evening. Mr. Okoha.
Very much. Distinguished and intimidating ladies and gentlemen. Quite frankly, this is a subject matter that is very important. And let me start by thanking the organizers for putting this together. I asked this question one time when I was doing my PhD in trade law. I asked my colleagues in the WTO, and I said, what is protectionism? Because that was the issue at that particular time. There was this accusation on the developing countries by the developed world, and the debate at the WTO resonated strongly. And people were asking, what? The developing world has protectionist agenda, and that the world should be moving towards a liberalized economy. And I said, who is protecting what? Can we take a look at this word protectionism? And when I sat down here and I was looking at that, to protect means to guide. To protect means also to preserve. Would you accuse me if I guide my territory? Would you accuse me if I protect or preserve what belongs to me? And in trade, and I learned from my colleague that just spoke about Nigeria's trade policy. Every 5 years, there's always a review of trade policies. Nigeria has been having that. And one of the allegations against Nigeria is that Nigeria is running a protectionist agenda, a protectionist trade policy. Nigeria needs to open up, liberalize the economy. And I keep asking, if we liberalize, if we open up, who are we opening up to? And what are we opening up for? If you look at your data, many of the countries in Africa that have opened up, in quote, including the fact that we opened up through SAP, many people have forgotten. What did we gain? Looking at the agenda of Nigeria, before you accuse Nigeria of running a protectionist agenda or trade policy, the first question would be, does Nigeria even have a trade policy? Many of the people here know this, that for several years, for the last trade policy that Nigeria had, Dr. Alaba is here. Thank you, I'm seeing you there. Thank you. Both of us were in the team that drafted the trade policy that never saw the light of the day till today. The last trade policy was in 2002. So, and several reviews have been done by the WTO, trade policy review team. So based on what are you accusing Nigeria of running a protectionist agenda? Put this into proper perspective. Who should be accused of running a protectionist agenda? Is it the person that I export my yam to and he throws it back to me and says, no, this yam had some fertilizer that we do not like. And there are some worms that are coming out of it. And before I know what is happening, he throws it back to me. And all the money I spent on the ocean drops there. If I borrowed money from the bank, I'm already trapped. Is that a man that would be accusing me of running a protectionist agenda? Is that a man that has a lot of laws and regimes that inhibit trade in the real sense? Or is that the same person who also brings up a lot of subsidies, pushes it to her own economic operators, her own farmers, her own industrialists, manufacturers, producers of all kinds, and they will be feeding fat on subsidy. And here we are. Look at the state of our infrastructure. And when it comes to competition, they say, oh, you are not able to compete. No, you must face competition. Competition between who and who? When, before the referee blows the whistle, you have already failed. In fact, they are 10 miles ahead before the whistle is blown. Let's be very sincere when we look at all of this. You know, about 2 weeks back, I went to Geneva. We were having this argument. And I think I also need to invite some people who will be going for the UNCTAD meeting at the WTO in Geneva. Now we are having a program looking at this same issue. And then looking at it from the e-commerce perspective. Look at what is happening now. Everything they want to negotiate at the multilateral level, at the WTO platform. So if my mother has a quarrel with my father, they are going there to negotiate on how they are going to sleep on their bed. Sorry. So e-commerce, good. But look at the template now. Those we call the GAFA, the Googles of this world, the Apples of this world, the Amazons of this world, the Facebooks of this world, and then the Alibabas of this world. Look at them, GAFA. They have parceled a draft agreement at the WTO for negotiation. What they intend to do is to lock up e-commerce so that they will continuously and continually, if not forever, be enjoying that and lock up every other entrant into the market. But they have forgotten that, check around Nigeria, check around Africa. Is there any of you that would say this is where Google's office is located in Africa? Have you seen any? No. Have you seen any Facebook office in Nigeria? No. In Africa? Where are they? Thank you very much. Their office is in the air. And of course, whatever you are getting here, it is out of your own data. Their business is you. Their business is you and I sitting down here. It is our numbers. and they're making their money out of us. And therefore, the same people are accusing our government of protecting our data. Government must protect what they have. What we have for now is that we do not have the competence of technology, but what we have is the number, the population, the 200 million people. And so, my friend, don't bring this at the table of the WTO and lock us off the entire track. Supposing any Nigerian gets up tomorrow and says, look, I want to, or I have an innovation, technologically, to be the next into the GAFA system, what happens when that has been locked up in terms of rules? Are you accusing us of protection? Let me end up with this particular illustration. I'm sure all of you know what has been going on with our people coming back from Libya. It has become a routine. But the whole world, under the WTO, signed the services agreement. Mode 1, 2, 3, and 4. Trading services. And Mode 4 talks about movement of natural persons, and they signed. Hey, why don't you allow the people, when you send back my yam, and then I or my son wants to go there, you also send us back, to the point that we are now trying to go through the desert and the waters. And many Africans are dying there. The same people who signed Mode 4. Why don't we apply this reciprocity? Allow us visa-free entry. So what are you protecting? And you're accusing me of protectionism. But you are the one protecting your own enclave. After having signed all of this, let's start our removal of protectionism from that particular point. From migration. Because trade and migration have nexus, and I'm sure we know it. Migration has labor nexus, it has trade nexus. Labor mobility. So why don't you remove that particular bulwark? So how would you begin to accuse me of running a protectionist agenda? In any case, the area that we opened up for a long time, look at the oil sector. What percentage of Nigerians are employed in the oil sector? Juxtapose that with how many people that are dying in the Niger Delta, courtesy of all the messes and the economy. And you look at the Niger Delta, you tell me that I will not protect my economy. I will protect more. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy that Mr. Ken has brought a lot of passion into the discussion. And we hope to have a lively discussion. I will go first and ask a set of questions, and then we will we'll give the mic to the audience to ask questions. So I guess my first question is for Ken. Now, is importing bad? And I'm saying this from this perspective. So imagine I am sitting in Arochukwu. I have cousins in Cameroon. I have cousins in Abakaliki. My cousin in Cameroon says you can buy my rice for 1,000 naira. My cousin in Abakaliki says you can buy me for 2,000 naira. Is there anything wrong with me choosing to buy from Cameroon? I'm not talking about the EU. I'm not talking about the US. I'm talking of fellow African countries right here who aren't doing any subsidies, who aren't really trying to cheat us, if you put it that way. Is there anything intrinsically wrong with importing from our neighbors?
I am not sure there's anything wrong with importing from your neighbor, but there must be an agreement between you and your neighbor in the first place. And of course, you know, if I go by the illustration you've given, the man from Arochukwu, which is perhaps where you come from.
Yeah, not really.
Oh, thank you. Trying to import from Cameroon must understand that these are two different regional economic communities working under two different trade regimes. Cameroon is under CEMAC, Central African market community. Nigeria, the Arochukwu man, is from ECOWAS. Now, and this is one of the things that we are talking about, AFCFTA, even within two people from the same ECOWAS region, there's an issue. There's a trade regime, ETLS, that guides or the trade transactions within ECOWAS, intra-regional transactions. The question is, to what extent has that been obeyed? Why is it that up to this moment, since 1975, ECOWAS was established, the first and foremost regime that came up in 1979 was the ETLS. To what extent has it been implemented? And yet up till now, we have just about 10 to 12% intra-regional trade taking place. And when I move my goods from here, I was just coming from an event we organized today on AFCFTA. A manufacturer of cement, including Dangote himself, was crying on how he's always betrayed at Benin Republic, Cotonou, here. Moving his cement across Cotonou to Ghana. So cross-border trade, look at the impediments. He mentioned about 48 different regimes and impediments he meets along the stride. Just between how many countries? Now, in answering your question directly, I think there is no problem with consumer satisfaction. Because I know that's where you wanted to look at. Consumer satisfaction. However, the entire gamut of economic well-being of the people does not have to do with the consumer alone. It has to do with other indices along the value chain. Satisfy the consumer, let him buy what he wants to buy from America. It's cheaper there after all. No, it is not cheaper at the end of the day. Can you consider capital flight? Can you also consider the fact that he is going to send money, change money, and it is dollar that is, the transaction is going to be dollar denominated? Can you also consider the fact that he is not helping your own economy to grow when you have substitutes here that he can buy from? He's rather creating job for that American. That's the point. Thank you.
Well, if I'm to understand it correctly, there are all these reasons why the Arochukwu man should choose Nigeria and not Cameroon. And some of them are valid, yes. But essentially you're saying the Arochukwu man should opt to lose money by trading in Nigeria, either because we want Nigeria to grow or whatever. But if I'm getting it correct, that's essentially what you're saying. I want to ask Dr. Akindele. So if the man chooses, or since we say neutral audience, if the man or woman chooses to buy Nigeria, there's a loss there, right? So what's the rationale for dealing with that? How do we rationalize that person A in Arochukwu should choose a loss by buying Nigeria versus buying a cheaper version from Cameroon? Because we tend to assume that people tend to want cheaper things. So how do you rationalize that?
I would just say it's irrational to expect him to buy from Arochukwu rather than Cameroon. I think for all of us, we would want to believe that we're rational people. And speaking candidly, if the price is higher here in Nigeria, for some you can just walk across, 10-minute walk to buy for cheaper, it means that there's some kind of redistribution happening in Nigeria that isn't happening probably across the border. These tariffs and whatever Nigeria has applied that enables the prices to be higher in Nigeria have the effect of redistributing surplus from consumers to producers. And when that happens, the consumer is worse off. So, I mean, the consumer may choose to do that, which I would think is irrational just for nationalistic reasons, but it does not mean it's an optimal solution. That's it.
So, but just to continue with you, he raised a very good point during his talk, right? Everybody argues, yes, we should trade more, we should let goods flow back and forth, but when it comes to movement of people, everybody says, no, you need to go and apply and submit a kidney and have it analyzed before you get a visa. So, I mean, is there some kind of double standard there where the world tends to be focused on the movement of goods, but once it comes to movement of people, it becomes a completely different story? Can you really think about productivity without incorporating both people and goods?
As I said when I was speaking earlier, sometimes policies are pursued, so maybe liberalization, so that people can come in and bring with them their technology. So there is a nexus there somewhere. But I don't think that you should try to pursue immigration issues through trade. You can have policies that bring the best in, and that also allows, you know, what you have comparative advantage in to go out. But to say that because there's an immigration issue, then you don't want to trade with your neighbors, I just don't think that's delivering a good solution for either you or your neighbor. That, in principle, I think in such situations, that's why you have a foreign office, and you will talk, you know, your foreign office talks to the other foreign office. Where you have an economic union, for example, the ECOWAS, there's supposed to be freedom of movement within ECOWAS. I know there are barriers to that, both for people as well as for goods. I have an example from a producer in the Gambia who does dry mangoes and wanted to import dry mangoes from Nigeria. And by the time he'd paid all the unofficial dues, it was cheaper for him to just import from China to the Gambia. Nigeria lost out on that simply because of the sorts of things that happen unofficially, which brings me to the point that I raised earlier, that when you do decide to seriously pursue growing your sectors where you have comparative advantage, somebody needs to take responsibility and sort out the mess. The reality of it is that the problems along the way, they're not going to disappear, and policy alone will not solve it, because from what this person tells us, they know what the official charges are, but the desk officer at the border isn't interested in what the official charge is. So there are issues, there are human issues that you need to deal with. But at the end of the day, those human issues need to be dealt with from the policy level, from implementation level. And then obviously immigration is a matter that you need to also talk, you know, sort of deal with. But at the end of the day, make sure that your policies are coherent and deliver for you and your economy.
Okay, thank you. And so just to continue on that kind of direction, so one of the things she talked about is the problems with moving stuff. I mean, we all know the bureaucratic ones, but there are serious infrastructure problems as well. You're the chairman of the Nigerian Trade Association of Nigeria, so you're probably very familiar with this. Can we really think about trade policy if we have our major ports, Apapa, in such a mess? Just today, the cashew exporters were complaining that most of their exports for this season are stuck there. They can't get it out because it's just taking too much time to move through the port to export. And I'm assuming that's the same for import as well. So can we really think about protectionism or whatever if we can't deal with these rudimentary issues like a port? It works very well. The Lomé port is now the biggest port in West Africa, bigger than Lagos, bigger than Papa. So how do we deal with these real barriers to trade, even before we get talking about whether we should import or export?
That brings us to the infrastructure challenge and the issue of competitiveness. And I think that when we are discussing protectionism, these two keep staring us in the face. The fact that we have infrastructure challenge becomes a disincentive to us in the first place. And I give it to her. She has also mentioned that some of these are man-made. And a few weeks back, we went to the port you just mentioned with the Minister of Agriculture, because there were some complaints from some of our members that their cashew had spoiled at the port there, waiting for export. And it was a sorry state. I don't want to go there. What we saw was not palatable. That was a loss to the economy. But we also discovered some intrigues, not being played by our own customs, but by shipping lines. Gentlemen and ladies here, we're all Nigerians. Majority of us here, I guess. You know, I'm going to say this with all the sense of humility. If you go deeply in search of what is happening, you will also see the roles that some of the shipping lines are playing in the same game. On the other side, at the WTO, we're negotiating trade facilitation agreement. I'm sure many of you here know. Facilitate trade, and then everybody sighs. And all of a sudden we just called that. Look, this particular trade facilitation agreement that we signed, in whose interest was it? And in whose interest is it now? Whose trade is being facilitated? Is it trade that comes in from outside to us, where the shipping lines will run quickly and ferry them, and before you open your eyes, they're already here in our markets. But by the time we parcel our own, we want to send out the same shipping lines. The same shipping lines are now telling you that they have to go through, they are on transit, they have to go through, Cape Verde, they have to pass through. Excuses and excuses and excuses, and before you know it, if they tell you that they're taking this thing today, by the next 2 days, it will be there for the next 2 weeks. So, and you begin to ask yourself, majority of the people who are working in those shipping lines, who are they? Now, this is one. Of course, we have our own problem, which is the infrastructure. All right? The ports, we know that we should open up One. We should have opened up Port Harcourt. Warri, they are there, but we have clustered everything in Lagos, and therefore the infrastructure, the roads there is dilapidated, and there's no rail. So everything is on that same road. Government has its own problem. We also have our problem. But I don't think that if you dig deep, the conspiracy, and I make bold to say it here, if you look deeply into what is happening, you also see a conspiracy finger from outside, making sure that that does not work. Anyway, thank
So
you.
just to touch on that, I mean, we like to say we're a big country. We are Nigeria, giant of Africa. But the truth is, Nigeria is only 0.1% of global economic activity. It's a very small target for a conspiracy theorist in practice. And we seem to always want to point fingers at everybody else. The ports are not working, oh, it's the shipping lines who are misbehaving. We signed a trade policy, oh, it was not done in our interest. At what point do we actually take responsibility for our own country, for our infrastructure,
we have taken,
for our own policies?
in my speech, if you got me right, I said we have our problems. The infrastructure problems that I talked about, I said it's ours. I'm sure you remarked that. The fact that we did not open up One, Port Harcourt, Calabar, Warri, is our own problem. Now we will take our head, carry on. But we are talking about unseen hands and anybody accusing us of protectionism. In any case, if you were sitting down here gently in your house and there's a gutter that leads to your house, and then you need to come into your house, but you cannot pass through there. And there is a rule that government must be the one to do that. You are incapacitated already by that rule. Even if you have money to do it, you cannot because there's a rule. But in this case, you may not have enough to even eat. So the issue of the infrastructure, you see, it is only now that we have seen the present administration is, has been doing one or two things to fix the rails. We clap for them. But these things ought to have been done since. Take a look at the road that leads from Lagos to Seme. And then take a look at the one that leads from Seme to Cotonou. You'll be ashamed. You will be ashamed. When last was it? So what I am saying is that we have our problems, yes, but the conspiracy is also there. Therefore, we should be very careful. Whether it is protectionism or preservation or guide, please guide your house, guide your economy. That's where I'm heading to. Thank you.
Okay, so my last question for Dr. Akindele before we open it up to the audience. Speaking of unseen hands and secret deals, you can't talk about protectionism without talking about politics in Nigeria. I'm going to give an example. In the 70s, there was a minister who owned a shoe factory and saw that his factory was doing very well. And he went to the government and said, these foreigners, they are coming to scatter our business. We need to promote domestic industry. We need to ban these foreign imports. He made sense, but the reality was he was thinking more about his own shoe factory than the actual economy. And we see it in the news up to now. Anytime you see a story about Nigeria is importing X amount of X, if you check who funded it, it's one manufacturer somewhere who is thinking about how he's going to get his own profits at the expense of everybody else. So are we pointing fingers in the wrong place? My question is for you, Dr. Akindele.
In terms of the way policies made, you will recall that I said that when these protectionist policies are brought in, a question should be asked, who's benefiting from this? You will recall also that I said that for any kind of protection to be given, there must be well-established evidence that that sector, that industry, that whatever, has potential for growth. It should never be done in isolation of everything else. And it shouldn't be done certainly just because somebody said so. So then who do we blame for things like that? You know, sometimes we have to look inwards to be able to solve some of these problems rather than outwards. Other countries have managed to turn their fortunes around. I'm sure they had their own conspiracy theorists as well, but they have come out of the poverty cycle, and their population are enjoying better welfare. So for me, I think that let's really look inwards to answer those questions. Always ask the question, who's benefiting from this? If it's not the general public, then let's look at the evidence, please. There must be evidence underpinning policy, otherwise we'll end up precisely where we don't want to end up. And regarding trade agreements and so on and so forth, one of the learnings that we've had in PDF, working with exporters, exporter voices, potential exporters, is that many don't even know about those trade agreements. So one of the things that we do is to try to train them and get them to come up to speed on what's available through those agreements for them as companies. Maybe the big guys know it, but the little guys who we should be focusing on don't know it. And it's the same thing with regards to other things that have to do with getting their exports out of Nigeria. In fact, with regards to the port situation, I think any port is only as good as its weakest link. And for Nigeria, the inability to get goods out of the port because of the lack of the infrastructure to evacuate goods is really the issue there. It's not really about who's externally, even if it takes 3 weeks, if the shipping line says it's going to take 3 weeks to get your goods to Nigeria or from Nigeria, you plan for that. At least they've told you how long it's going to take. But when your goods arrive in Nigeria and then they can't get out of the port, then it becomes a problem. I know that some things have been done in this administration to sort of revive the railways, but we really do need to look into other types, because my understanding is that the rail infrastructure is quite old. You're reviving it, but then it's probably not what you need for 2019. You need something a bit more advanced. So much should be done about getting the link between our ports and the cities that need the goods that come into Nigeria much quicker. If those things can be put in place, then Lome wouldn't stand a chance against Nigeria, is my view. And then there's also the fact that with those things in place, the ports itself, Nigerian Ports Authority is going through a lot of reform as it is, because we're working with them also. We're actually doing a port competitiveness study currently where we have compared Lome, Tema, Cotonou with our Nigerian ports. And what that study is telling us is really Nigerian ports are not that bad. The issue is getting things out of the port. That needs to be sorted out. I know government has signed an executive order giving tax credit to companies that come forward to try and help us solve these infrastructure issues. But yeah, more needs to be done.
Okay. So at this point, we'll open the floor for questions. We would ask that you not be like the panelists. You keep your questions to 1 minute.
The temptation to speak is too much in this forum. That's why I'm standing. My name is Dr. Dayo Kusa. I'm a conflict transformation expert and also a political economist. First of all, from where I'm coming, I'm a political scientist. I want to say ab initio that politics determines economy. Politics determines economics. And you cannot talk about the economy of any political enclave or a sovereign nation without talking about the kind of politics the country is playing. We say we are a capitalist economy in not so many words. I want to say a number of things in staccato fashion, 2 or 3. I will still stay within the 1 or 2 minutes. What is our trade policy? We have none. So that is where we should begin from. We should get a trade policy on Nigeria's website for the whole world to see what we're about. So that people will not just be thinking we are doing a protectionist thing or we are liberal. Where is our trade policy and the trade agreements?
My name is Modejike. I don't want to talk about the infrastructural deficit you mentioned. You've spoken well on that. Because if you don't have the infrastructure working, we're only wasting our time. Now, why can't the port be okay? The other 7 you talked about, some of us have some input in it. And we know that implementation is not going to be as easy as that, but then it is a bold step to start. Since the government doesn't have the money, they wrote a tax policy using tax CIT to do the roads. Then all those big guys like Dangote and Coke can come on and provide the money for the infrastructure that leads to the industry. That's the basic objective of the tax policy we're talking about. But I want to lay most of the problems we have at the doorstep of government. Why do we encourage monopoly, especially in the era and the sector cement factory? I know there's a premier cement industry called Nigeria, and Dangote is running a monopoly almost in this country. And we cannot do that. Government is not really helping the matter. We need to restructure this economy. We need to diversify, you talked about. And these are the only way we can begin to do things meaningful. As long as government is paying lip services to most of these things, we cannot do anything. The power is not there, the roads is not there, and how can you do business? What is the competitiveness? Now, that is why most of the goods from China are cheap. Now there is export of labor from China to this place. I had the opportunity of being at the international airport, working, and I know most of them coming in, they pretend not to hear English, but they know how to work here. They are exporting them. The jobs that people are supposed to do, they are doing it. So what are we doing? What's the government doing? Why can't government regulate some of these things? It's a big problem. The unstable fiscal and macroeconomic policies affecting
Please, 10 more seconds. 10 more seconds.
Or diversification. So we are talking about the DFI. When you have very unstable fiscal and macroeconomic policies affecting this DFI, how can we do it? It's not stable. Inflation is high. Interest rate is high. A lot of things are high. And somebody who planned 10 million yesterday to do business, today is going to cost 100 million to do the same business. So what is happening to us? These are some of the things we have. The protectionism, you said that you need to protect it, sir. And Doctor, you said it's high time Nigeria jettisoned it. So when we live here today, what are we living with? Are we going to maintain protectionism? Are we going to do away with it? Thank you so much.
I was in Geneva for a while. I was covering WIPO for South Center. I don't know if you know South Center. And the problem we always have in Nigeria is because we don't have a developed national policy. We go into negotiations for an agreement and we just sign. And then we start complaining after we've signed. I'm a lawyer. And if you've signed an agreement, then you have to stick to the provisions of the agreement. So what you need to do is take your own country's perspective into consideration and go forward to the... In fact, because South Center, what we do is we prepare countries, developing countries for meetings in Geneva, right? And then you find that a lot of the delegates that are sent there because they're civil servants and it's their turn. They have no idea what's going on. And then all these, all these groups, GULAC, I can't remember their names now because I've been away for a while, but they lobby people to sign agreements, offer them all sorts of things, and they sign agreements that they do not understand. In fact, in Geneva, we had a joke that whenever it's a serious thing, they take it to New York or Geneva, and the delegates go shopping. If it's not serious, then they take it to Addis or Abuja, and everyone sits there. So I think, the first thing to do is sort of conceptualize and design and agree on a trade policy before we can even engage. And so I don't think I don't really think we can be pointing fingers. We've been doing this for years now in Nigeria. We keep blaming people. It's not really, that's just, yeah, thank you.
So my understanding is that Nigeria has a trade policy, but it's outdated. The WTO does a trade policy review every 5 years, but I'm with the lady that just spoke. Nigeria needs to take trade negotiations a lot more seriously. It needs to come to the table when negotiations are being had. AFCFTA negotiations are currently ongoing. There's only one more country signature that's required for them to go forward without Nigeria. You're not even at the table where negotiations are being done. How can you negotiate for yourselves? How can you protect yourselves then if you're not there? Nigeria is just absent right now. And it's a terrible shame that Nigeria can be absent at such a negotiation. Half the stuff that's published about AFCFTA is not really the should I say, correct picture. People are not well aware of what's in there. What Nigeria should have signed back last year when the opportunity was there was just a framework to say, let's negotiate. And you even refused to sign the framework. So how can you then complain because if the other countries in Africa go forward with that trade agreement, Nigeria becomes an accession state. To get into that agreement later on is entering it, behind the curve. It cannot be to the benefit of Nigeria. So yes, I'm with that lady. Nigeria needs to bring its brain to the table and negotiate hard to get the best possible out of the agreement for Nigeria. Not being present is really not an option. Regarding government's role in promoting, the question that the gentleman here spoke about, government's role in promoting monopoly and all of that. Well, I don't work for government, so I cannot presume to speak for government. But again, it's that question that I asked, who's benefiting from it and how strong are they at lobbying? So Nigeria does run a system of patronage. Vested interests determine a lot of things, as the political economists will tell us. So at the end of the day, you and I get a raw deal. But hopefully, some of these things will be addressed in the next level, the next 4 years. Otherwise, we're stuffed. So, I mean, those were the two. And then, obviously, there was also the question on protectionism versus liberalization. And again, I reiterate, be there, be present, and make use of the opportunity to the best of, the benefit of Nigeria. I would say definitely be liberal. Otherwise, you do not even have access, okay?
Thank you very much. I think I would not disagree with the fact that Nigeria needs a trade policy. And of course, I raised that matter. We need a trade policy today and like yesterday. Again, I don't know, unrepentantly, I would say this, that we prepared a trade policy for this country. And it was at the point of being signed at the Federal Executive Council that some unseen hands, too, asked for, in quote, international input. Dr. Laba, please, if I'm wrong, correct me. And it was at that point that they withdrew the memo. I have a copy of that memo till tomorrow in my office because we drafted it. And some international organizations said they wanted to bring international, because the then minister said, look, he appointed 5 key people to man the 5 key components of trade. And we did a good draft that looked at import substitution agenda of the trade policy that belongs to Nigeria. And that was how it collapsed. Immediately, those people said, okay, we want to make some inputs. And they went and did some things and then came back and said they want to plot some implementation strategy into the trade policy. And then we went. Because they didn't want what we have designed. But all hopes are not lost. There was something we started about 8 or 9 years ago. Leo, can you raise your hand? Thank you very much. Leo was one of my staff, and he was the head of our legal department in my office. And we started this, just raising the issue of competition and monopoly. We started the battle on competition, raising a competition law for Nigeria. Since 2009, it was only just last month that His Excellency signed that into law. And if I tell you also, and he's my witness, what happened? Several of these fingers also did, spiraled a multiplicity of the bills. And there was confusion everywhere, correct? Almost at a point, it was about 5 bills. And we ourselves that generated that bill, originated it, we are confused. We didn't know which one is which one again. I'm telling you what is true. So until a time we started ruling, and then eventually they started marching, and some people left the National Assembly, some people came in again. You know, here we are today, we have a law. But I think that's a progress. So I think whatever we are doing, and that's why I said I love this. I believe in letting us have our regulation. Let's regulate our trade policy space. Let it not be eroded. Let nobody decide for me. I give an instance, I move 20-feet container from Hamburg to Apapa Wharf. €850. That's what I pay. But that same 20-feet container of my small shoes that I produce in Aba, send it to Tema. I spent €1,350.
What of to Kano?
No shipping. I mean, I'm talking about, okay? I'm talking about the shipping. I'm just referring to that particular thing. So that you look at it. Look at it. This is just by my backyard here. Tema. In Ghana here. The one that came from Hamburg in Germany. €850. The same 20-feet container is now costing me 1,350. I mean, who is fooling who, for God's sake? Let's know on that. Let's understand the undertones of these things. We are doing the practical business. We tell you what is there. We need a trade policy, and I agree totally. And that will help us if we can also maintain on that trade policy without fearing who is God. I mean, whose ox is being God. That will help us. Finally, is that when we have such a trade policy, it's also very important to monitor the implementation of that trade policy so that we don't create billionaires, policy billionaires, overnight. Whether you like it or not, private sector people are always watching, looking for new rules. And in every law, at least I'm sure many of us are lawyers. In every law, there must be an opening. Once they go, piam, and they become billionaires. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take questions from this side this time. We can start with you, sir.
Good evening. Thank you. Two things. I think I'll say three things. Dr. Mrs. Kusa, I like the way when she started with the political angle. And I would say that that's being a student of that school, it's the most crucial element. And I always say that the day you get your politics right is the day you get your country right. Until Nigeria achieves that, how we're going to achieve it, I don't know how we're going to do it because we're not working together yet. We don't know where we're going yet. We're just a confused country and a captured country when it comes to how to rescue ourselves politically. So until we crack that, there is no progress. I'm sorry to say this as cold as that. 10
more seconds, please.
Yeah, the lady mentioned no, that can be 10 more seconds. The lady mentioned the fact that we don't have a strategy. I think it's deeper than that. We need to be a lot more integrated. We're looking at trade. I'm looking at the whole gamut of what development is. Nigeria does not have a defined direction as a country. Without a defined direction, you cannot be looking at the subsets of development. So we're traveling rudderless. We're traveling without a map, without an objective, without a destination defined in mind. Two things. Three, this is back to the political space. We have a filtering system that promotes the worst of us to get into power and shuts out the best of the best. Everyone should begin to think about how to crack this. That is the biggest challenge we have as a country.
Thank you. So we'll take...
Good afternoon.
Okay, I'll go back there.
My name is Carl Korinja. Very briefly, some interventions, and maybe you might want to respond to them. One is protection, protect what? What really do we have of value? Or do we understand that we have something of value that needs protection? That's one. Two, growth. What kind of growth? Are we protecting, are we interested in protecting Chivita, for instance? Are we interested in making Dangote richer? Are we channeling our energies towards protecting Dangote? We must ask ourselves what we want to protect and what kind of growth we are looking at having. Having said that, I find Ken very, very interesting too. I remember I encountered you during the European Partnership Agreement with National Planning Commission. Then I was a consultant there. It's not, you cannot ascribe the problems of Nigeria to unseen hands and international manipulation. People will always do what they need to do for their own interests, okay? What is Nigeria doing in response to that? This is what our thinking should be. Secondly, when we say we don't have a trade policy, I disagree. We have in Nigeria the Nigerian Office for Trade Negotiation that has been saddled, I mean, just go on your phone right now and Google it, that has been saddled with the responsibility of negotiating all of these trade agreements. If they're doing their job or not, I wouldn't know. But that coordinating structure is in place. When we say we have protectionism or liberalism, what is working, I don't know. Why don't I know? Because we have tried almost every rule in the book. We have tried import substitution. That gave rise to Dangote and the rest. Cement. Okay? Chivita. That's import substitution. Why aren't we continuing? I don't know. These are questions we need to interrogate and ask ourselves. So before we jump at saying that let's let go of something, we need to ask ourselves, is it really something that requires deeper looking into? Then, we also have to look at, yeah, sorry, just 5 seconds more. Yeah, okay, 2 seconds. We also need to think about export. When you're talking about export promotion, okay, we had the export expansion grant in Nigeria, where manufacturers were supported, okay, with certain kinds of support, tax breaks and so on, in order to be able to allow them take on some of the burden of the weak infrastructural system to stimulate and encourage export. What has led to that? I don't know. I have a lot more information. I used to be in the government. I understand what the challenges are, but my point is that even in our conversations here, we need to direct our conversations more intelligently. We need to understand what is the problem. The problem is not a bereavement of ideas. It is, someone has suggested that there's political manipulation, I agree. Unseen hands, I wouldn't blame them. What is our response to it? We need to think a little bit more closely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good evening, everybody. So I followed every of your conversations, and it's been pretty interesting. But I just want to bring this to mind. So 2 years ago, I spent quite an amount of time in Algeria. And when you talk about protectionism, I haven't seen any African country that has actually executed protectionism as much as Algeria has done. They are also an oil-dependent nation like Nigeria, but you need to see what they have done for their people. Very soon, they will not just be assembling vehicles in Algeria, thanks to their protectionism, but they will also be producing and manufacturing and allowing Algerians to understudy them through these processes, so that very soon, Algerians themselves will be producing their own vehicles in Algeria. Now, the Dangote we're talking about also made an attempt several times to break into the Algerian market. But thanks to the protectionism again, he was unable to do so. So again, I agree with Mr. Ken here, who says whatever it is, we have to protect it. What is ours, we must protect. We must get to a point where we're able to communicate our strength to the world, or they will make us see what we have as our strength, as our weaknesses, which is what we have been able to carry as our burden as a nation. Thank you.
Okay.
3 quick questions. The first one that I want to ask is that...
Please, one question, please.
Oh.
So pick the best one.
Well, I don't know actually now. Well, let me pick this. Despite government intervention variously to textile sector, why is the sector dying instead of the intervention working for development of the sector? Let me choose that. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Nigeria had a thriving textile sector, I think up till about the 70s. And then, policies changed. A lot was done to try to protect textiles. But by the time you look at it again, textiles, the sector has died, basically. And a lot of things have been done to try to revive the sector. There's the, I think it's called the CTG, so grant, really basically, so that's cotton and textile grant to try and revive the sector, and that's been around a long time. It has not worked. Despite how much of it that BOI says it has dispersed, it has not worked. Recently, actually, 2 weeks ago or so, the CBN decided that the importers of textiles would not be able to access Forex through the official markets anymore. Again, because it wants to protect textile sector to try and give them a chance to be revived. Personally, I think it's not the right policy, simply because when you ban the textile, the ban on their access to Forex means that they're not able to import textile as they used to. On the one hand, perhaps you could see the reason why CBN thinks this will revive the textile sector, but on the other hand, what happens to the garment making sector? By the time the textile sector is revived, that sector will be dead. The garment sector would have disappeared because the local capacity to produce their inputs is not available right now, yet the ban is right now. Where's the sense in that? It beggars the imagination. I cannot understand why the CBN would do that at this time, because what about the impact of this policy on the other sector? So when you say protect what, I would, there was a question around what do we need to protect? My view is, which I said in the beginning, is perhaps protect those sectors, or should I say support and encourage those sectors which have a proven potential for growth. There must be evidence that this sector has that potential. And then you can bring in policies, incentives, and those sorts of things that will encourage growth in those sectors. I'm not very familiar with the Algeria situation. However, I know that China for a time was very closed, but they didn't become the power they are today until they opened up. So looking at the Algeria situation and thinking that's what's going to work for Nigeria, I beg to differ. You have to look at what's on ground in Nigeria and understand the underlying data and evidence. And that's what Nigeria should base its policy on, what works for Nigeria, not what has worked in Algeria. Also to speak to what kind of growth, as I said earlier when I gave my presentation, I think an export-led growth is what Nigeria needs to do. Nigeria is doing all it can to attract investment of FDI, but then in a more practical sense, Nigeria can pursue an export-led growth that is inclusive. And the reason why I made such a big deal about working with MSMEs, the little guys, is because that's the way to generate inclusive growth. So Nigeria needs to do that. That's what Nigeria needs to do, in my view, to drive growth. You know, we've got, 37 million MSMEs in Nigeria? If they begin to grow, the jobs will appear. If they begin to grow, the economy will expand. And Nigeria won't have to, Nigerians won't have to suffer in poverty for so long. Within a few years, maybe 20 years, Nigeria could be in a better place if only there could be a single-minded determination to make it work for Nigerians. Yes, as I said, there is a trade policy. It's outdated. It's been reviewed several times. NOTN has begun the process of developing an up-to-date policy, to which they invited comment and contributions from the public. I don't know how many people responded to their invitation. The group that we're working with that are exporters, we actually partner with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, NESG, to present a position to NOTN, which we believe they will incorporate as they go forward. But I think some of the things that people, the demand side can do is also quite important. That call was out there. I'm not even sure who heard about it, who responded to it. The demand side is also missing in all of this, because if there's a demand on the NOTN to tell us what our trade policy is, maybe they'll move even quicker. So yeah, I think that there's work, there's ongoing work, but the information isn't really out there. Somebody also asked about why not import substitution. I think I dealt with that already, talking about textiles. It really just doesn't work, because when you make a policy, you need to impact assess it across board. So I know Dangote in cement is a successful story, it's supposed to have created some jobs, but what was the total impact on other sectors? We need to start to look at policy holistically, and that's why I talked about coordination earlier. Don't just wake up and do something here like the central bank has done on textiles without thinking about, and Nigeria is such a big, everybody talks about Nigerian fashion. That industry could disappear before the textiles people start producing. It's such a draconian thing to do. Anyway, okay.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Mr. Ken, we're running out of time.
I think this is where I disagree a bit with my colleague. Frankly speaking, if we want to look at what happened to the textile industry, go back to the SAP. And the SAP that introduced the Bendan boutiques that we have today. To the point that even underwears, second-hand underwears are being sold in the market. Thank you very much. So, and that killed, that liberalization, that opening, killed that textile sector. And, on one hand, we are bashing government for not having rules on trade policy. On the other hand, we are also saying the government should remove rules. The CBN has brought up a regulation, not a ban on textile. But what it says, look, just like what happened to the 41 items, if you want foreign currency for textile, please stay in your house. Go and buy it outside. We are not going to give you. So that we will allow this textile sector breathe a bit and come up. That's exactly what the CBN has done.
Well, what happens to the garment sector, who depends on textiles?
Thank you very much. It's a factor of the revival of both the cotton, the ginnery, the textile, and the garment put together. And this is not just,
without wanting to turn into a debate, the largest textile industry in Africa today is in Mauritius, and they grow absolutely zero cotton. So I think, unfortunately, I wish we had 2 more hours to go into this, but I think we need to think about the interconnection between sectors. Of what use is it if cement goes up but construction goes down? Of what use is it if textile goes up and garment sectors goes down? We might end up in a net negative position.
Nobody is going to convince me, and I'm sorry about that government, the CBN, is saying, look, for textile, we are going to regulate our movement of currency, just like we did in toothpick and others. Things that we can't produce, what we have as alternatives here. Please, why are you looking for, foreign currency to import them? And somebody mentioned China. Did China grow like that? No. When did China come into the WTO, for instance?
And that's when their growth started.
You know, it's not when their growth started. They started with locking up themselves. Eat what you produce. Enjoy what you produce. Charity, they say, begins at home. Thank you.
Okay. The crowd is getting restless. Unfortunately, we're out of time, and we can't take any more questions. But I would like to ask you to exchange numbers, interact, talk about this. We can see it's a very complex discussion. It's a very passionate discussion. And I would urge us to not end the debate here, but take it forward. See what we can learn about China. Don't believe what the panelists have said. Go read it for yourself. What did China do? What did Algeria do? What is Nigeria doing? So at this point, I'd like to call Dr. Iro Agedo to give a quick 2-minute vote of thanks.
I want to sincerely thank all of you for honoring our invitation to participate in this program. Dr. Nonso, thank you very much for those introductory but yet insightful comments on the debates on protectionism and your expert use of the Socratic method of teaching by asking questions. Dr. Titi Akindeyinde, thank you for your salient perspectives on the motivations, opportunities as well as challenges inherent in protectionism, and for grounding the need for utilitarianism in our economic policy. That is, our economic policy should benefit the greatest number of people rather than the elite, and also for emphasizing the need for coordination in our economic policy, especially by asking the question, who benefits? That is very, very important. Then Dr. Ken Koha, thank you for your critical reflections on the politics underpinning Western protectionist agenda, and for emphasizing the need for eroding double standards, especially in regard to globalization of labor. You know, the point is that you asked if capital can be globalized, why can't we also globalize labor that we have? I believe when people were registering, you did put down your email addresses and your phone numbers. We are going to issue a communique maybe early next week, and I implore you to get back to us on the communique, make your inputs, and let us know. Once again, on behalf of the Nestle family, I thank you all for coming. God bless you.